for probably about a dozen more people. For those of you who either haven't seen those prison experiments or the other obedience experiments and would like to join a discussion. Hopefully 40 of you won't show up, but that's unlikely. There are a lot of other classes during that time. So if a few of you want to come, we do have room. 7 till 9, Stevenson 2075, Thursday, this coming Thursday. Also, I'd like to announce next week's event, because it's hard to do it usually at the end of the session. Richard Paul will be speaking. As you know, he's the director of the Critical Thinking Institute on this campus. He's a real forward thinker in terms of issues that are going on in academia. He'll be talking on the application of critical thinking to Holocaust issues and human dignity. It should be a real good session, and for anybody who has either had a class on critical thinking or who thinks that they might be involved with the Critical Thinking Institute in the summer, the 4 or 5 day conference in August, this would be a good taste of what's to come. Does anybody else have other announcements that need to be made? I apologize that I'm not doing the slide presentation that I had mentioned to a few of it. I hadn't done too much publicity about it because I wasn't sure if I would all done, and I didn't, because I wanted to do, Jean had started it with about 16 slides on caricatures of anti-Semitism in medieval woodcuts. And the handout that I'll give you today, which I did as a bit of a substitute, shows some of the woodcuts. This was the form of propaganda that they used in medieval history to convince people of the devil, which is the harm that Jews might report. So what we'd like to do in the future, perhaps Jean and I, is to put together a slideshow that would show, there are a lot of woodcuts that show witches as the devil, Jews as the devil, and show how the ideology of the Middle Ages contributed to the consequent genocides of the Inquisition, the witch burnings, and eventually the Holocaust. Because you can see in the caricatures some carryover into Nazi propaganda, if you look at the way that Nazis used concept of the Jewish communist devil harming the people of Europe in some of the caricatures. So at some point we'll maybe have that available, but I was not able to do enough of the camera work to get the some of them done, so all of them done. Starhawk, I don't know where she is. Maybe she'll fly in at some point, I don't know. Because at a very important event in Santa Rosa at noontime, where women from all over Northern California were coming together to discuss the Bosnia issue. And I'm sorry I couldn't go because it probably was going to be an amazing event. They were going to have women speakers from Yugoslavia and a number of women healers from Northern California trying to raise money for women and children's shelters in Yugoslavia and trying to discuss the issue and see what can be done in a situation. So, did anybody go? Yeah. Monica? Okay. You want to just very briefly?
So, yeah.
Yeah.
There was only one woman from Croatia. She's a history professor and leader of the feminist movement, and unfortunately, the doctor who was going to be there from Serbia couldn't make it. They're doing a tour called Mother Courage all throughout the United States this past week to talk about what's going on there. So, but it was a very good event. They raised $1,300 to go towards the center.
Great.
So if people want information as far as sources to write and find more information, you can come to me. I gathered some information there.
All right.
So it was a really good event.
Okay, thank you. Come on in and take a seat. I have some handouts here that I'm going to start with. One is the UN convention that everyone was waiting for and asking about, so I'll go ahead and pass that out. Why don't you do that?
I'll do it next time.
Yeah, we have time. Right. I think there's not going to be a lot of students that are going to. Who knows? All you need is 1 or 2 good people to do that. So. While that's being passed out, I'd like to answer Phil Beard's few of his questions about the UN convention because it's been raised. No, just wait. I'll do that in a minute. We had the question of when was it ratified and how and this sort of thing, and who brought it up. And even though it had been declared as a convention in the UN with about 80 nation states in 1946, right after World War II, the United States did not sign on until 1986. I ask why, but in fact, the United States has only signed 4 of the 22 human rights conventions before the United Nations. This is something you need to bring up with your legislators. This is something you need to bring up with your representatives, because we don't know, I don't know why the United States has been so recalcitrant. You'd have to study the hearings in the United Nations to see why our foreign policies or whatever are violated, we think, by this. But finally, after 30 years of neglect by the United States, the convention was resubmitted by Jimmy Carter, who was, as you know, a human rights advocate, after 30 years in 1977 to the Senate, and it took another 9 years before it actually went through the Senate and through the United Nations to be ratified as our vote. And Ronald Reagan did. So that was one of our questions as to whether he actually had been involved with it or not. But there are 18 other human rights conventions that have not been signed by our country, which I think is a shame, because they all involve aspects of human rights around the world which affect people's lives, and that have been agreed upon by the majority of the United Nations nation states in the General Assembly. So that's about the UN. And then I have a handout for today, actually 2 different things. One is a short genocide reading list, which I put together, because that kept coming up too. What are the resources for genocide? There are not that many books that specifically address genocide. The majority of them talk about the Holocaust as a genocide, but do not talk about comparative genocides or theories of genocide. So you'll see that it's a fairly short list I could find at this time. The third handout for today is a little packet that I put together to give you some visual images of medieval history and what went on with the witches. Some of them are fairly graphic, some of them are Old English, because the majority written the 14th, the 15th, or the 16th century. So you'll see that their use of English is very different. It's very quaint. And it takes you a while to figure out, in fact, what some of the words are. Within the packet, there's also a bibliography on witch persecution and on the medieval documents that give us a lot of the information about them. There is a page of quotations that show some of the reasons why in occult world misogyny exists. Everybody know what misogyny is? Woman hating. Women hating. And this is the primary reason why we have the genocide of the witch burnings in the Middle Ages. And it's very interesting to read what a lot of the documents, a lot of them are religious documents from all the major religions that propagate hatred, fear, or distrust of women, which is part of the problem that we find ourselves in. Yes. Now I start going fast and start slow. At the end of the packet is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, which was passed in 1979, which I felt was appropriate to add, given the abuses against women, which we'll be talking about today. I guess so.
Good afternoon. I'm Gene Kravis. I'm with the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and the Holocaust Study Center. In 1984, students who didn't know each other met in Dr. Steiner's course on the Holocaust. And we have been involved ever since in some sort of a advisory capacity. And one of them is the person you're going to hear today, who is now the program coordinator, Carol Hurwitz. I'd like to call attention to a book that is not in your bibliography. It's called Woman as Healer. It's a current publication by Dr. Jean Achterberg, PhD. You should be able to get it readily out of any library or bookstore. It's an excellent book. As it says, a panoramic survey of the healing activities of women from prehistoric times to the present. She's really Carol Hurwitz, RN, nurse practitioner. Now, a nurse practitioner is a very well advanced trained nurse healer, allowed to by law to do a lot more independent work with patients than the ordinary RN. If she did what she has done in her lifetime, year 1300, there might not have been enough steaks to go around to burn her. To give you an idea. She's a nurse midwife. She delivered babies without the presence of the physician. Bad, bad. Carol has come from a family of the Protestant faith. The Protestants were your original heretics. Okay. She's knowledgeable in herbology and some of the alternate therapies in herbology. And she has, by the rights of her profession, prescribed pharmacological agents, again, without the presence of a physician in the room. Very bad. Okay. Attends group meetings of women. Wow. And, unfortunately, sad side, one of her ancestors was drowned as a heretic, not in Europe, but in the good old USA. Okay. Dried. Okay. She claimed by her own, this is her own confession, that she has a female spiritual guide. And has our guest arrived? Yes, okay. You are going to be a witness that she consorts with witches. Carol Hurwitz.
Thank you, Jean. And I have to say that Jean's support for my studying this issue is one of the main reasons that I did it. Thank you, Jean. He found resources for me, found woodcuts, and has a strong interest in this field. So that's been an important part of why I did it. What do you need? Your book. Yeah. Yeah, okay. I'm going to speak for a short period of time about the overview of the witch persecutions and give some of the more academic reasons or historical and sociological reasons why this could have occurred, and also some of the historical facts. And then at a certain point, I will introduce Starhawk, and we'll talk. She'll talk about what she knows about the witches, and also talk about her practice as a witch. And I'll give a little more formal introduction of her at that time. I have to get this more comfortable here. Our subject for today is the witch hunts and persecutions of medieval and pre-industrial Europe. This is not a pretty subject, but it's disturbing and bizarre. It's particularly threatening for women and for girls to research and study, because it's the story of how our gender was specifically targeted for over 3 centuries for special forms of terror, torture, and murder. It is just 301 years since the last group of so-called witches were hung together in this country in Salem Village, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. 114 of those accused and tried of the 140 persons were women. 14 of those hung were women. On your handout, you'll see that there's a short list of the first several, maybe 14 or 15 people that were in that trial. I thought it was for you to actually see the names, the convictions, and the outcome of those people's lives. Because it does make a difference when you see someone's name and realize it was a real person. And my relative, Margaret Wilson, was tied to a stake in the ocean and drowned at the age of 16 for being a heretic in one of the 13 colonies. She didn't believe the same things as some of the other people, the dominant characters in the group, and she was drowned for her beliefs. Ask, what does this have to do with the Holocaust? Let's see. Yeah, there's another one. Are there any more of the witch packets available for Starhawk? Well, maybe I didn't make quite enough. You don't have them either? Okay, I guess we didn't have quite enough. I'm sorry. Maybe someone could pass it up to her at some point so she can see what's in it. I'll start again on this part. You may ask, what does this have to do with the Holocaust or genocide? The mass murder of hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions of women and girls between the 13th and 17th centuries in Europe and a small number here in the colonies has been called by some historians the women's Holocaust. I don't choose to use that term for either with a large or small h because I prefer to save that term the very worst and most complete example we have of genocide in the 20th century, the destruction of the 6 million Jews and 5 million others under the Third Reich. On the other hand, I would like to explore with you whether this was not a certain unique form of genocide, the definitions and descriptions we now have available. The field of genocide studies is slowly expanding, and our terms, definitions, personal and academic responses becoming more complete and therefore more useful. I would also like to show that genocidal practices are deeply embedded in the cultural milieu of Central Europe, giving rise to the witch murders, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust in that order, and then most certainly migrating to the New World with the new settlers who were in contexts, and then discuss with you and Starhawk alternatives to these pernicious and chronic forms of human destructiveness. The theme for this year's lecture series is finding meaning in the Holocaust. For some of us who are women, it is impossible to find adequate explanatory meaning in the Holocaust, the witch burnings, or any other genocide without examining the male-dominated, women and minority excluding, political, bureaucratic, economic, military, judicial, financial, and religious structures which engineered these events. Unless we examine the the underlying values, norms, and ideologies, and the corresponding socialization processes, as well as the mechanisms by which the same abuses of power continue to occur around the world, we are doomed to continuous re-victimization and to fleeing from one killing zone to the next. As it is estimated that a woman is assaulted every 16 seconds somewhere on the planet. And there is not one nation-state in the world at this time where women have adequate safety and full or equal human rights to men. Hannah Arendt is probably the most well-known woman political scientist. She has written, and I quote, "This is what is asked of us at this time," meaning since the Holocaust, "to think what we are doing. If we are serious about saving human lives, decreasing human destructiveness, and ameliorating human suffering at the hands of other human beings, we are forced to become more honest, emotionally and intellectually, to discover the causes within ourselves, our relationships, and our societies. I would like to suggest that we have more than enough information, knowledge, research in many fields to take serious and effective steps, if we can develop additionally the moral courage and strength as individuals and societies to are doing and to act on what we have learned." The 4 primary resources that I used, there are about 50 books on witchcraft and the witch burnings in this particular library, the SSU library, and there are about probably 20 or 30 scholars worldwide who specialize in this. But the 4 that I used in particular are Brian Levack of University of Texas at Austin, Hugh Trevor Roper of Britain, Marianne Hester of the University of Exeter, also of the United Kingdom, and Christine, sociologist at University of Glasgow in Scotland. These 4 people have written excellent books and articles on this subject and were the best sources that I could find. So, who were the witches? Who were the victims of the witch hunts? There were several primary categories, and I'm sure Starhawk can add to this her perception of who they were. The first category, as Jean mentioned, were wise women, healers, and midwives. Another category were old, poor women, and in those days you're talking about the 50 to 70-year-old age range as being considered elderly at that point. Spinsters, widows, and single women without husbands were more likely to be persecuted and burned. Women in atypical female roles were more likely to be selected. Joan of Arc is a rather renowned example, but she, in 1429, led France to victory in the 100-Year War, and 2 years later was staked for defying the church, taking leadership, wearing men's clothes, and being a witch, according to the church, as it was defined at that time. Any woman could be accused of being a witch, and so was vulnerable. Any woman. Any person, man or woman, who defended a witch or was related to a woman accused of witchcraft could be attacked. 15 to 20% of the people who were persecuted, hunted, convicted, or put to trial and convicted or burned were men, children, or homosexuals, because also during this time, the papal bulls that the Pope put out were against homosexuals in particular. Sodomists were also considered heretics. So a good percentage of the men who were burned at that time were homosexuals. Who were the hunters or perpetrators? They were church leaders, magistrates, judges, lawyers, ministers, priests, popes, mayors, governors, and official inquisitors who were appointed to the job or who self-selected themselves for the job all over Europe because they felt uniquely gifted for this position. They were also resentful or opportunist townspeople and villagers in small towns particularly, and mobs caught up in witch crazes, panics, or hysterias. There were also scholars, authors, and medical doctors who were very involved. The range is all similar to the Holocaust, and the main perpetrators were the men in positions of authority. They stepped forward to valiantly defend their Christian faith against the danger. How many women were involved or targeted? This is a very difficult point for me because as an academic, I have a very hard time, or a future academic, I have a hard time using figures that are not exact. And I got such a range of figures that it was very difficult. The smallest number I got was several 100,000. The largest number we've got, which is commonly used in Scandinavia, Germany, and France, is 9 million. Now, this is over 3 centuries, so maybe we're talking about 3 million a century, because we're talking about whole generations, 2 and 3 generations of women who were burned at the same time. If a woman was a witch, they would also take her grandmother, her aunt, her daughter, before twice, because they felt that they were contaminated and would also become witches just by association. So we have approximately 9 or 10 generations of people who were affected if you're talking about 3 centuries. There were millions who were accused, denounced, hunted, and jailed. There were millions who were tortured. We do have these records. Put to trial, thousands of trials in cities, towns, and villages. The trials, the picture of the trial map shows just all over Europe, except for a few exceptions. It usually involved groups of women with a few men defenders. There were occasions of single women witches being burned or being put on trial, but the majority were in groups, because group activity on the part of women, as Jean alluded to, was one of the things that was considered very suspicious. That the women were in a conspiracy state in the church. And we'll talk about that a little more, what the particulars of that were. There were hundreds of children, especially girls, that were killed. Sometimes whole families. We don't even know the total population of Europe at that time. It's kind of difficult to extrapolate, because you also had the plague in the 1300s, the mid-1300s, which wiped out sometimes a third of mostly urban areas. It was more of an urban disease and problem of so forth, so that in some towns during the same time you might have a third of people die of disease, so it could be very difficult to know what the total population was at that time. Although at this time, there are scholars all over Europe that are beginning to try to put together this information. When did this occur? Approximately the 13th through the 17th centuries. The worst period was 1600 to 1650, which is actually late medieval or pre-industrial. You're getting you wouldn't hardly call it medieval, so it's pre-industrial, which is the worst time in terms of numbers of people killed and numbers of trials that went on. Also, bad time was the 50 years before that and the 50 years after. But that was the worst period of time. We can talk about why if we have time. Where did this occur? Almost all European countries. Great Britain, France, Germany, the Mediterranean, Scandinavia, the Baltics, the western part of Russia where they were not Eastern Orthodox, parts of East. Many of these countries are just now beginning to do the research to even find out what happened there. One prerequisite in these countries was there needed to be either Protestant or Catholic Christian influence for it to occur, because it couldn't occur where there was not an active, sinister belief in the devil. There had to be a strong belief in the devil for people to project the devil into someone else. The mildest areas were Ireland, where you had the Celtic influence occurring, and they found it kind of ridiculous to go after witches because the witches were still their healers there. Denmark, which is interesting, was also very mild. There might be some interesting historical parallels to the Holocaust if we look at some of these countries in terms of where the most severe brutality was versus the mildest. Austria didn't seem to notice that it was happening too much, which does not fit the Holocaust pattern. And then Italy and Spain seemed to be more interested in killing Jews. So during this time, they were busy with the Inquisition, and they didn't seem to have time to chase witches to speak of, except up in the mountains. Switzerland had many, many trials. Tons and tons of people denounced and accused, and it was going on all the time, but for some reason the prosecutions were mild, and they had injunctions against torturing or killing pregnant women or children. So it's considered one of the milder areas. The severe areas, where there were longer trials, longer span of witch craze and persecution, more killing and burning, were France, Poland, Scotland, so I'm disappointed to find out, being Scottish, but especially Germany. Germany had the longest span of hunts and murders, the most number of tortures and victims, the most notorious witch inquisitors. The two who go down in history as the all-time witch burners are Jacob Springer and Heinrich. They were also responsible for the most famous book, the Malleus Maleficium, which was published in 1486, and which was basically the Inquisitor's manual for how to prosecute and kill witches. There were at least 2 towns in Germany where they killed all but one woman. This is on the town register, so this is not something someone made up. You may know these cities, I don't. Würzburg and Trier. Trier had large numbers of people killed in just a few days, and the fantasy and craze that went through. It was the summertime, and one of the witches who was caught said that she or he had seen an assembly of 8,000 people with the devil out in a field somewhere. And so the inquisitors went finding 8,000 people, because the thinking was that if someone saw it, reported it, it was fact. How could this occur, and why? Well, it seems that the devil appeared in Europe in the Middle Ages and began to consort with thousands of women. More seriously, the primary reasons that I've found for the witch murders, I referred to Barbara Tuchman's very excellent book on the calamitous 14th century called A Distant Mirror. And in that book, she lists among the things that are a major problem: the Black Plague, constant wars, overpopulation among feudal peasants, increased peasant uprisings against landholders, state, and church, and so we could call that the beginnings of class struggle. The return of folk religion and magic after about 1,400 years of strong repressive Christian society, and rebellion against the strict church dogma that was coming out of predominantly ideology, which ultimately ended in killings. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation, as I mentioned, the Protestant Reformation also brought additional religious strictures, not the same as the Catholic, but now you had individual sin, evil and goodness, and repression of folk culture in a new way than the Catholics had. There began to be more conflict between the Catholic and Protestant churches and beliefs, and then we find it between the beginnings of rational and scientific thinking and superstition, magic, and sorcery. If we want to look at it from a sociological perspective, we would use some of Dr. Steiner's terms like anomie, the existential insecurity and loss of norms. During that time, there was change in women's roles. Women began to take on some power, and indeed it was very threatening to the church and the state. There was extremely rigid, dogmatic, absolutist ideology. And I'd read you an example of a sermon given in London in 1627 by a man named William Perkins, who was a minister, and he was basing it on the book of Samuel in the Old Testament. It says, "It is a principle of the law of nature holden for a grounded truth in all countries and kingdoms, among all people in every age, that the traitor who is an enemy to the state, rebelleth against his lawful prince, in capitals, should be put to death. Now the most notorious traitor and rebel that can be is the witch. For she renounceth God himself, the King of kings. She leaves the society of his church and people. She bindeth herself in league with the devil. That's the basis of the ideology that people were using at that time for women to comply with. Did not comply, was a heretic. Men and women, but at that time women were really more focused on as impossibly, incurably dissonant to the church. Now the victims were historically disenfranchised women in many cases, not always, because there were wealthy women pulled into it and bourgeoisie women and so forth, but majority of women at that time were barred from universities, professions, couldn't own property, they were at the mercy of their fathers or their husbands, they had no legal recourse, often no money. And for rural women, the primary roles available were multiple reproduction, farm, and domestic labor. They were obviously quite vulnerable and had no power or authority in the system, and they were easy to take advantage of. The authorities began to pass laws. It started with something called the Papal Bull of 1484, which was Pope Innocent VIII. And actually Springer and Kramer went to him and asked for it, because they wanted permission and they wanted validation for what they were going to do. So, and he complied, and he was happy to do so. So there was then there was actually a law that said that people must prosecute witches and must go after these threats to the state and the church. The Malleus Maleficium followed soon after and was republished. It's a big book, has a lot of things in it, very negative to women, and it was 14 times in 40 years. So of medieval books, it was probably one of the most common. Books were just beginning to be published during that time at any great amount, and it was mostly the church that was reproducing books or authoring them in the first place. So canonical or church law and secular law were passed during this time to support the prosecutions. Legal systems, courts, the medical profession, clerics, and pseudoscience, as I'm calling it, because they considered themselves scientists, but they were using strange and absurd concepts, such as something called spectral evidence, where if you imagined something, it was real, and you could convict somebody with something called spectral evidence. You imagined them flying through the air, and that was considered evidence. This is hardly something we'd call science. In any case, it was used to define, describe, punish, and condemn. What are the terrible crimes these women were guilty of? Well, there were two main classifications. The first one was a simple one, which has existed since witches have existed, and that's maleficium, or causing misfortune. You could call it black magic as opposed to white magic, or bad magic as opposed to good. And we don't even know that anybody did this, but this was the classification of evil that witches were accused of, and included hundreds of behaviors, some of which could happen or might not happen. Causing male sexual impotence, changing into animals, causing hailstones, winds, or death or illness of people, drought, animal illness or death, any misfortune or accident, any strange event that happened that couldn't be explained must be a witch. They were accused of making potions, of throwing hexes, of having evil eye, and having sex with the devil. The worst, obviously. The last part, the fantastic activities with the devil, which and of having conspiracies with women and Black Sabbaths and all this kind of stuff. Starhawk might want to talk more about that. It's a whole area that, it's a huge area in terms of description. People's imaginations really got carried away, and what they imagined witches doing is phenomenal. Just thousands and thousands of things that I don't know who would have had time to do. But the second classification is called heresy, because to consort with the devil, went through the trial process, it was very unlikely that they were going to be considered innocent. Although we do have a few, like in the Salem trials, if you look on that list, there was, I think, one person. Maybe she paid the judge off, or maybe she really was innocent, and we don't know what the conditions are that got her off somehow. Anyone could denounce or accuse someone of being a witch, which was a real problem, because in terms of taking evidence, it could be anyone, including me, who might denounce you. And all evidence was equal in the witch trial. So there was no choosing of fair witnesses. There was no jury. There were the inquisitors. And once you entered the process of being denounced, you were highly likely to be convicted, because the means of evidence, they were trying mostly for confession, because with ideological crimes, and we're talking about ideological genocide here, crime, the confession of the person is the key to convicting them. It's no actual evidence or factual occurrence or behavior that's measured per se. It's their confession that condemns them. And so they tortured them until they confessed. So this is hardly a court of justice. There were 2 or 3 main tests that were used to tell which or not. One was the hot water test, where you plunged your arm into boiling hot water, and if you burned, you were, how did it work? Let's see, I'm blanking out here. If you didn't burn, you were a witch, which meant then that you went to actually be burned, and if you did burn your arm, then you were normal. But in any case, what they did is they stacked it so you would not be able to be innocent under any circumstance. And the swimming test was the same way. They tied you up, hand and view, into the water, and if you floated, I'm getting confused for some reason, but if you floated, you were a witch, and if you drowned, you were not. So if you floated, you got killed anyway. So all the tests were stacked so that you had to die, basically, after having some discomfort, quite a bit of discomfort. And the means of torture were quite amazing. The two other things that were precursors to this happening was the use of propaganda. I call it propaganda. There was no such word at that time. But it was used, propaganda, to convince the masses. And this included sermons, homilies, poetry, songs, books, and tracts, all written to convince the population of the wickedness and devilishness of women and witches, which raised fear and incited mobs and created a lot of panic. And then new technology, hardly machine guns or gas chambers, but a lot of them were designed especially for women. We had something called the Iron Maiden, which is a big iron box with 2 sides. They closed the door, and it was like being suffocated. And all parts of your body were immobilized by this huge Iron Maiden until you begged out and confessed, which in many cases meant making something up just to get let off torture for a while, which then convinced them of your guilt. If you rejected giving in at that time, then you just were put into something else. They had something called the mouth pear, which is a pear with four parts, which they would increasingly open wide in your mouth. There was the dunking chair, where they dunked you as many times as possible. There was the garrote, or the iron collar, which actually killed probably as many women as burning, because many women would be killed with the garrote or the iron collar, and then their corpse burned instead of actually burning at the stake. There were thumb and toe screws. There was something called the boot that crushed your leg. There was a stretching rack. There were special eye gouging tools, which came in a nice little box, handcrafted box. There were something called the strappado, which seemed to be particularly popular. And this was a pulley system with ropes where you were tied with your hands behind your back and then hung up over a beam. I think the Nazis used this too. Very possible. And then they had something called the skull press. So you can see the variety of things that they used to convince themselves that women were witches. It's possible that lack of means to destroy people might have, kept the numbers down. Some of the secondary causes of the witch hunts, and I'll try to wrap this up pretty soon here. The overriding purpose, and I think Starhawk will probably agree with me on this, I don't know, we'll see, was the social control. Because at that time, women outpopulated men. More men had died in the Black Plague, more men had died in wars, and women were taking on power in the towns they were active in, the peasant uprisings, and this could not be under the religious misogynist perspective of the times. Christianity's dark underside, with its repressed sexuality, aggression, and hatred, and fantasy as were very active here. And Matthew Fox, who Starhawk has worked with, is one of the best explainers of the Dominican priest attitude that brought this out originally. And of course, many other men got in the ball game, but those were the people that started it and began the ideology. And this was not something particularly new. Religious misogyny had been evident in Christianity since St. Paul in 30 AD. He was the first person to really write either ambiguous or negative things about women. And many other church fathers, if you want to read them, it's really fairly shocking because it violates our sense of what Christianity ought to be. St. Chrysostom, Augustine, and Martin Luther, most of them hated Jews and hated women both, and it was very obvious in their writings. Why? It's a very complex question. I don't know if I want to answer that today. The functionalist theory, if you want to look at it from that perspective, would ask, what needs and purposes of society were served by this behavior? It provided explanation for misfortune. It gave triumph of the masculine over feminine principles in life, left brain over right, science and reason over superstition and magic, urban over peasant, resolution of intolerable tension and conflict, political, social, and cultural, finding of appropriate scapegoats for society's ills, a moral cleansing of society, and an exorcising of evil. So some people would say it was a social evolution. The rest of us say it was a Holocaust, or let's say a genocide. The last thing was that it became quite a financial undertaking because witch trials and burnings became very popular, and people would travel all over Europe to go, and it would bring in a particular village or town. And you needed all kinds of people. You needed a courtroom, and you needed places for people to stay over, and you needed lawyers, and you needed the gaol or the executioner, and you needed all these things. And so it provided quite a bit of income to people periodically, which is kind of a cynical way, but it should be included, the economics of the situation. My last section here, before I turn this over to Starhawk, is that should we call it a genocide? How do we define it? Mary Daly is a theologian, famous theologian, who has called it a gynocide. Gyna is a word that comes from, or a prefix that comes from the Greek. It means woman. This would give us a genocide, but in a different category, because it's only women, and we're not a class, we're not an ethnicity, we're not a political group per se, we're not a religious group, whatever we are, although they're debated in terms of which is that there's some sense of it being a spiritual group for sure. But we're certainly a gender group, and I think that it defies the current definition that we have of genocide, except that I think it does need to be considered a genocide when a whole group of people is discriminated against and murdered on the basis of their gender. And certainly we are identifiable, and witches at that time were identifiable easily as female by physical features, clothing, etc. So it wasn't as if it was easy to escape. It was not something they could escape. They were born a woman. Under Article 1 of the United Nations Convention, it defines genocide not having to happen in a time of war. And even though there were wars all over Europe during that time, I think in general this was happening in peacetime. Article 2 doesn't have gender group in the classification if you look at the definition. And I think perhaps it ought to be added. It's definitely a genocide if you look at Part A of Article 2, killing members of the group. All or many members in a particular family, extended family, or village were sometimes murdered. They were not a tribe or a race per se, but the female reproductive function of a family group. The family at that point was deprivability, sometimes for generations, to reproduce its own gene pool. And often there were 2 or 3 generations of women in a family killed. Hurwitz, which is on your bibliography for genocide, Irving Lewis Hurwitz, whose book on taking lives, does not mention gender at all. It's not in his classifications yet. On page 17, he says, genocide is a structural and systematic destruction of innocent people in a bureaucratic system. Now that's pretty general. That certainly would cover this. He also says it represents a systematic effort over time to liquidate a population, usually a minority. Second, it functions as a fundamental political policy to assure conformity and participation by the citizenry. Now, women are not a minority. They're almost always a majority in the world. We run about 51 to 53% of the population at a given time on the globe, and sometimes as high as 57 in areas where there's a lot of war going on. But We're classified in sociology as a majority group with minority status, which is a little different. We have minority status in almost every culture that we're in, even though we're a majority. So we're a sort of special category which maybe should be added to the minority groups. Kurt Johansson, in a book called Genocide Watch, says genocide is a form of one-sided killing. State or other authority intends to destroy a group as that group and membership in it are defined by the perpetrator. Now that opens up a whole new area. It's a much more liberal definition and gets us into problems with political massacres. But I think in this case, there's no political element. So I don't think that we have the problem of falling out of that definition. Because in fact, the Jews were only defined as such by the Nazis. It was not something that they would have self-defined at that time, particularly some of the ones who didn't consider themselves Jews but were considered so by the Nazis. Same for some gypsies. And then the witches were defined as such by the inquisitors. They were not necessarily defining themselves as a witch in many cases. So this would cover, in this definition, genocide. It allows other groups, even those imagined, defined, or labeled by the perpetrators, because the perpetrator is the important quality in this situation. Europe in the witch-burning times could be described as a genocidal society, where a state arbitrarily takes the lives of citizens for real or alleged deviant or dissident behavior, and a torture society. People victimized short of death returned to that society and left as living evidence of high risk of deviant or dissident behavior. These are all in Hurwitz. He has 8 categories of societies in terms of how they treat citizens. And Europe during that time qualifies under 2 of the very negative societies, the genocidal and the torture. And the last way that I wanted to look at this particular gynocide or genocide is Raoul Hilberg, in his book on destruction of the European Jews, gives us a process of escalation to violence, which Dr. Steiner has also added to. And the 3 main categories for escalation of violence to genocide are first defining the victims, definition, and then concentration of them, and then annihilation of them. That's a very simple 3-part step. Dr. Steiner has about a 20 or 25-part step where he breaks it down into categories of how the perpetrators treat this group in society. I've done it in about 6 steps, 4 witches. Definition, they're first defined as a witch. Legislation, the laws which apply to them, which have already been decided. Seizure and concentration, they were put into jails together in groups until people decided what to do with them. Torture, trial, and conviction, which is the next step. Condemnation, annihilation, where they're killed, often in groups in the middle of the town, and then confiscation, because yes, indeed, people did take their belongings and their houses and their property away from them after they and their families had been decimated. So there are a lot of parallels in this regard with Jews and the Holocaust, even though we have to stretch our imagination to see how this fits. I'm almost done here. There's not time to adequately address anti-Semitism in medieval times. I wanted to, but there just isn't time today. It's a very important parallel with the sexism of that time, and maybe we'll get into a little bit in the discussion. There's a real rich literature on this subject anyway, showing the exhortation of Christians to fear and hate Jews, and they were being murdered. Jews were being murdered all through this time, but in a different pattern and in a slightly different way. But I just wanted to make a few comments about sexism and racism. I went looking for books that would, theoretical books in sociology, political science, women's studies, that would integrate what we know as racism and sexism, so we can kind of come up with parallels and comparisons. I could find almost nothing. So evidently this hasn't been done yet. There's a rich field on racism and ethnocentrism. You can find in the library people that have done work in this, and then there's also a lot of books on sexism and misogyny in society, but it's very difficult to find anyone who is comparing them or drawing parallels or interrelating them. There are a couple black women who've written, Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, who've written on the double jeopardy or triple jeopardy of being woman and a woman of color. And that's the closest we can get to people analyzing the effects of both racism and sexism on a particular life or on a particular part of the culture. I would like to propose the thesis that sexism precedes racism as a rule, not in every case. And sexism doesn't necessarily exist, they don't always come together. But I feel that sexism is the training ground for racism, particularly for men who will take prominent power positions in society. Woman or female is the first other or stranger that the young male differentiates himself from, separates from, or may not reject in his identity quest and bonding with other males. Sexism teaches superiority, privilege at the expense of others, and dominance of one gender over the other. This is systematic. Part of most societal social is to foster concern and respect for women, for the female gender, and to encourage the enfranchisement of ourselves in society. It's very banal, but it's startling in its simplicity. Because so far we're very much missing the mark in all cultures and societies. Secondly, we need to actively work against all forms of domination. Not just racism, but racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, the forms of domination, including ones that we may indulge in ourselves as women. One more thing, we have the film Burning Times. It's in the Women's Resource Center for those of you who would like to see a very graphic depiction. Starhawk is in it. It's an excellent film. I have it at home right now. I'll be bringing it back to the Women's Resource Center for anyone else who is interested. Now I would like to introduce Starhawk. I've been to 2 of Starhawk's healing workshops over the years, which were wonderful for me. It helped me a lot at times when I was suffering in my life. And Starhawk is not just a witch, a practicing witch, but she's the author of several books. One's called The Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, Dreaming the Dark, Magic, Sex, and Politics. And her other book before was Truth or Dare, Enters with Power, Authority, and Mystery. I guess you have another novel coming out, right? Yeah, right. So she's prolific in her writing. She's a feminist and a peace activist. She holds an MA in psychology from Antioch West University. She teaches at several Bay Area colleges, and the one I've been most familiar with is Holy Names, right, in a Catholic college in Oakland. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I want to say first that I am a witch and I also am a Jew by birth, and so both of these subjects are ones that are very close to me. And it's the question of what are there connections between the witch burnings and the Holocaust, I think is a very interesting one, and I think that there definitely are. But first, let me give you some definitions and some background on how I see the period of witch persecutions. First of all, what is a witch, or who? There's a song that goes, who are the witches? Where did they come from? Maybe your great-great-great-grandma was one. And quite possibly she was. The witches were the remnants of the pre-Christian and spiritual traditions in Europe. Much as today in Latin America, for example, if you go to Mexico, you will find that the country is a very Catholic country, but there are pockets of places where the Indians still live and practice their indigenous traditions, and every little town and every little village will have its healer or its curandera or its bruja that there's a little, they're making a lot of noise. That people go to, if they need healing, and there's no doctor around who knows herbs, who knows what to do when you're sick. Oftentimes they would be the midwives, the ones who would particularly be in charge of women's reproductive health, because, again, in this medieval Renaissance period, up until the Renaissance in Europe, men were not involved in childbirth. It was a radical idea to get male doctors involved, and that was part of the reason for the persecutions. Today in Mexico, you can go have your cards read, or you can have somebody light a candle for you, and oftentimes she may speak in terms of Catholic names or saints, but the underlying mythology goes back to things that are much more. And sometimes there'll be a really wonderful sort of mix between the two. And that's very much what Europe was like up until the end of the time of the witch persecutions. We have this illusion that Christianity came in and everyone became Christian and it was very homogeneous, but actually the church had a very light hand on a lot of places until very, very late. Even actually in Ireland, which today is one of the most staunchly Catholic countries, Ireland only became very Catholic in the 19th century when the English outlawed it as a reaction. Up until that time, a lot of the Irish really hated the church and didn't like the church at all and thought it was very repressive. And in fact, there was a great little article just a couple of weeks ago on St. Patrick's Day in the Chronicle, in the end paper. I don't know if you saw it. Some remembrance of his grandfather, who was sort of the old Irish school, getting very irate at what he was being taught about St. Patrick and saying, you know, St. Patrick, what did he do? You know, he didn't get rid of the snakes. That was the climate. And besides that, all he did was ruin the Druids, and the Druids were great people. You know, so that kind of memory really surfaced for a very, very long time. And the old traditions, the old religions, the pre-Christian were carried on as folk traditions, as customs that would go along with different holidays, often holidays that were then taken over by the Christians. Things like visiting a certain well and asking for healing. Even today, again, in Ireland, you can go to St. Bridget's Well. And when I went there a couple of years ago with a group of women, ritual there, and we had to clean the well out because it was choked with plastic, among other things. And I said what a shame this was. And they said, well, you know, it's an old custom that you go to the well and you tear off a strip of your clothing and tie it on a bush by the well and make a wish or make a prayer. But nowadays what people often do is rip up a plastic bag and tie it on the bush. You know, so there were customs like that that go way, way back that originally had nothing to do with Bridget as a saint, but Bridget as an old goddess. And all over Europe, you will find, again, these remnants of things that people would do, of dances, of songs. Sometimes you'll find it even in the embroidery patterns that women would use, or in Russia, in the Ukraine, I should say, the tradition of making very beautifully decorated Easter eggs. If you look at the symbols on them, they're all ancient pagan symbols. And they were carried on as healing traditions. Because again, up until very late, you didn't have doctors who were trained somewhere at a university. You had someone in the village who learned something from her mother or her grandmother, whatever, that was passed on. And some of those traditions were purely herbalism or sometimes a form of chiropractic. Even today, again, in France, when I was in France a few years ago, my best friend fell off a ladder. And we took her to the local healer, who was somebody who had learned how to do this from her father, who had learned it from his grandmother, so on and so forth. And she took her and bent her over a chair and gave her a vigorous massage for about 3 minutes, green bloody murder, and she was fixed. She was better. So there were all kinds of healing traditions, some of which were physical and some of which also involved understandings of more subtle energies. Some of the same kinds of energies that now, for example, acupuncture and Chinese medicine take into account, and Western medicine is only just beginning to rediscover. And they were carried on, these ancient traditions, through myths and through legends and through stories and fairy tales, though often they were changed a lot and took on other kinds of coloring. So again, for example, the stories of King Arthur that we all grow up with, if you look at them and read them another way, are the remnants of older myths and the doings of older goddesses and gods. Now, the European indigenous religion, or religions, because there were many, many varieties, were very much like the Native American traditions in that they were earth-based. They were centered on the way that the sacred is embodied in the natural cycles and in human beings and in the interactions between the human community and the natural community. And so they were not text-based. You know, they didn't have a lot of scripture. They not had a lot of liturgy involved, but they were centered around rituals that were done according to the seasons, that were around particular places that were sacred, and particular acts that people would do, offerings that you would give, ways of bringing the human community into balance with the natural world around. So if you have that understanding of witchcraft, it put a different cast on the witch persecutions, because the way that I look at the witch persecutions is that they were a deliberate attempt through torture and terrorism to redefine the sacred. Up until that time in Europe, in spite of Christianity, for the broad mass of people, the sacred was still embodied in the earth and embodied in nature and embodied in their relationships. What the witch persecutors did was to sever that connection, to make the quality of the sacred, and when I say sacred, I mean that thing which determines all our other values, which tells us what we can and cannot do. It took that out of the world and out of our bodies and took sacred authority away from us as human beings and put it out there somewhere and embodied it in sets of rules and hierarchies that filtered down to different groups of people differently. So that men were closer to it than women, certain men were closer to it than other men, so on and so forth. That wasn't an easy transition to get people to make. Take sexuality. In the older tradition, sexuality was sacred. It was a way of connecting with the goddess, with the gods, of honoring the life force. Pleasure was considered a sacred quality. Sexuality brought fertility, not just to human beings, but also human fertility and also human erotic pleasure. Whether or not it resulted in conception was considered to be a good thing that made the crops grow and the rains fall and put everything in balance. Needless to say, the church didn't like that, but you have to consider a dilemma in trying to get people to make that shift. I mean, if you have a choice, you know, if I say to you, okay, here, you can either believe that your sexuality is sacred and pleasure is sacred and this is good and you're inherently good, or you can believe that it's evil and dangerous and you can only do it under these certain conditions, and if you do it at all, you're going to have to pay for it by having kid after kid after kid after kid, you know. What are you going to choose, given a free choice? So the witch persecutions, in a sense, were a way to take away that choice, to drive home to people so deeply that all of this stuff was dangerous and nasty and dirty and don't do it and life-threatening, that we still, we still carry that, I think, today. And when I say this, I don't mean to say that this is, that Christianity is bad. I think within Christianity you can also find traditions that say life is sacred, pleasure is sacred, the earth is sacred, those things. But the Christianity that was in power, both in the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and the Christianity that had a stake in holding on to its power over, that is the kind of Christianity that had to war against this idea of immanence on all different levels. So one of the areas was the severing of the sense of sexuality as good. Another had to do with healing. The witch persecutions were an attack on traditional healers and all the healing methods that they represented as part of a larger process that was going on in time, particularly the 16th and 17th centuries, that I call the expropriation of knowledge. Was taking knowledge itself away from individual human beings and saying, okay, knowledge now is, there's going to be a certain body of it that is going to be passed down to you through institutions, and it's only going to be real knowledge if you get it through those institutions. This happened very clearly with medicine, and it happened in other areas. For example, that was the time when the first dictionaries began to be put together and the first grammars. Up until that time, people had just talked. But now there began to be a particular way you were supposed to talk that was codified, and you had to learn it from certain people. So the male medical profession, to be a doctor, you had to go to university, which women weren't allowed to. You had to speak Latin. You had to get your official seal of approval. And somewhere in here I have the actual statistics. There weren't a whole lot of them. In 1524, for example, in London, when the population of the city was estimated to be 60,000, the College of Physicians monopolized medicine and restricted their membership to 12 physicians. By 1640, when the population may have been 360,000 to 420,000, they had increased their ranks to a total of 43. So, as you can see, they were not serving the broad masses of the people who were still going to their traditional healers. But now this became an area that was sort of fraught with danger, much as it is today. In fact, if you look at what is going on around safeguarding women's right to make choices about our bodies and about pregnancy, anyone who is willing to provide abortion services now, again, has become a target and possibly a victim of violence ranging now we've seen to murder, which is a direct legacy of the persecutions. Also, the witch persecutions were a class war as well as a gender war. And I think that's one reason why they're difficult to pin down, because they serve, as you said, if you look at what function they served many functions. And this was a period of time, the height of the persecutions, the 16th and 17th centuries, where the economic were undergoing a major change. Feudal society was a land-based society, and wealth was in land. And society functioned mostly according to the wealth that you got, which was stuff that you got in kind, actual food, wool from your sheep, certain numbers of hours of service from the peasants who lived on your land. The land supported armies, and the armies supported power, political power. This began to change with the Crusades, with the revival of trade, with money becoming more and more important, and with the conquest of this continent and the bringing back of all the gold that they stole from this world, there was an enormous inflation. Now, the landowners often were hooked into traditional bargains where they received a certain number of rent or a certain number of hours of service, and suddenly the rents they received weren't worth very much anymore. And so they were under great pressure to maximize the profit they could make from their land. And one of the ways that they did this was often by enclosing the land, dividing it up into pieces. Again, up until that time, land was not seen as a commodity. It was not seen as something you could just buy and sell freely. A piece of land was full of all kinds, a whole network of different rights and responsibilities. So you were the lord, and you were the lord of a village, and you owned this forest. Forest in our sense, a bunch of trees in the woods. Your peasants might have the hereditary right, 5 of the families, to graze their pigs under your oak trees at a time of year, and some other family would have the hereditary right to collect the downed wood, and some other family would have the hereditary right to collect thatch for their dwellings. And those peasants might not all have separate individual fields. Then it's like, okay, this is John Smith's and this is Joe Johnson's field. Instead, many of the towns and villages in Europe had communal fields because it took a lot of people together to be able to put together enough money for the heavy plow and the oxen that were needed to pull it. And the village would decide together, okay, you get this strip of arable land, you get this strip of grazing land, you get this strip of hayfield, and we're going to all plow on this day and cut on this day. And there was a great deal of kind of literally grassroots village democracy that went into the guarding and the harboring of those resources. That, of course, all changed when the upper classes began to say, no, we want to own this piece of land from here to here to here and be able to do what we want on it, and maybe what we want to do on it is get rid of the villagers and graze sheep, which takes less labor and makes more money because we can take the wool, and now that there's trading routes that are opened, we can make a lot of money selling wool. And so there was a tremendous amount of resistance to this process, as you can, from the peasants. And that was at the root of a lot of the peasant rebellions that you did mention. With that background, you can look at the witch persecutions and see that they were a very clever way of destroying peasant solidarity, because nothing is going to fragment a group of people and keep them working together and keep them from rebelling against their overlords, as well as sowing hatred and suspicion among them. And as you can well imagine, I don't know about you, but if you think about, say, the kids you went to high school with, right, some of whom you may have liked and some of whom you may not have liked, but imagine if any kid in that high school could destroy absolutely any other kid who they didn't have a grudge at or might be mad at that day, simply by denouncing them as a witch. And that person would be taken, would be tortured, would be killed, and all of their money and property would be confiscated. And that person would also be tortured until they named other people. So you can imagine that would destroy, you know, your pep rallies for your football team pretty damn fast. And so that also is something we have to look at with the witch persecutions. At an economic base, and they served the ends of the consolidation of a very rigid and despotic form of power. I often think the witch persecutions are to Western culture. They're like if you have an abuse in your own life, family, if you're abused as a child in ways that are so horrible that you repress it and you can't even think about it and you don't remember it. And then you grow up and you don't know that this terrible thing happened to you. But you go out there and you try to have relationships and do things and fall in love and start a family, and something is always wrong, and you don't quite know what it is. And this pain resurfaces in many, many different forms, and it can't be healed until you go back and look at the history and go through what's often a very, very painful process of remembering what it is that happened to you. And I think for us, the witch persecutions are like that. They're a trauma in the European psyche that never was healed and can't be healed until we're willing to look at it. And because the same patterns and the same dynamics have resurfaced and continue to resurface. And so I think the Holocaust, which does have many, many similarities with the witch persecutions, but primarily you have to understand that it arose out of this psychic ground, out of the ground of people who just a few generations back were living on this level of terror and torture, on this kind of ground that thinks that terror and torture is the norm, is the way to work things out, is the way to change consciousness. And I don't know if my ex-husband once had a bumper sticker on his van that said, "Force, it works." This is one reason why he is my ex-husband. But there is some truth in that you definitely can change consciousness through terror and torture, even though it, you can only change it in certain ways. You can make it worse, you can inflict fear, you can inflict pain, you can repress things, you can keep people from doing things. You cannot open up people's creativity, cannot open up people's compassion, you cannot heal people through terror and torture. So maybe I'll stop there and let you ask me questions.
Okay, let's see. Why have you chosen to be a witch?
Should I sit down?
Yeah, why don't you sit down and get comfortable here? Yeah. Let's see.
Why have I chosen to be a witch? Is this on?
I don't know. Hello?
Okay. I guess, is mine on? Yeah. All right. When I encountered witchcraft for the first time, I was 17. I was actually a freshman in college. I had had some very powerful spiritual experiences that always seemed to take place in nature or take place involving my own sexuality. I think I had an intuitive sense that this was what was really most moving for me. And I had also had a lot of Jewish education, and at that time, none of my Jewish education ever talked about these things. And then I was doing a project on witchcraft with a friend. Through that, we met some people who were witches and came in and began to tell us about the old religion of the goddess. And it just, to me, I went, yes, this is something I've always known about. This describes the experiences I've actually had. I just never knew that there was anybody else out there who thought the same way. And so that was how I became a witch. And why I've chosen to be a witch is because it felt right. It continues to feel right.
Do you think people are afraid of witches today?
People are definitely afraid of witches today. Sometimes laughably so. When I spoke in Ireland, there was a radio commentator who kept going on the radio saying that this woman is going to unleash a flood of black magic and terrorism. And I'm going, me? You know, little old me. Gee, I didn't realize I had that much power. Here in this country where there's like a church and every crossroad back and forth, where everyone's gone through Catholic education, where they've been indoctrinated in this from day one, the thought that I, with one 20-minute speech, could undo all of that is pretty amazing. You know?
What do you attribute that modern fear to?
It's the legacy of the witch persecutions. Again, you know, they've left us with fears, with stereotypes, with ideas about witches, with this idea that there is this horrible principle of evil in the universe that you can get entangled with without knowing it. And that the world is full of malevolent people that are going to do you harm, particularly with that women who are powerful or women who are strong are dangerous and evil. And women who are old also, because that's part of the stereotype. Women who are not young and sexually attractive, unless they're like Glinda the Good Witch. Who's somehow always so much more insipid than the Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah, right. Do you think there are good and bad witches?
Some of us are better. Witchcraft maintains some of the ancient knowledge of what we could think of as a very old psychology, very old understanding of how the mind works and how the mind can affect things around us. And those powers are not just known to witches, but they're known in every single culture all over the world. And yes, they're used in helpful ways, and they can be used in harmful ways. Now, in our tradition, as it's developed, we have very strong strictures against using them to harm. We have a saying that anything you do with magic, with this art of directing and focusing your consciousness, anything you send out will return on you 3 times over. So I think of it as the golden rule amplified. You put it out, you get it back with a wallop. And that's a big stricture against harming somebody with it. You have something in the questions you wrote about black and white witchcraft. And those are terms that I like to discourage because I think they perpetuate this racist assumption that everything white is good and everything black is evil. And I'd prefer just to use good and bad or good and evil. So, witchcraft is a religion. It is a spiritual tradition. It does have a set of ethics, that say everything is interconnected and everything that you do has to take that into account. But like any other religion, I can't guarantee to you that everyone who's a witch always follows those ethics.
Do you see any parallels or any similarities between fear and hatred of witches
And babies. The fear of the other, the idea that there are these people among us who are not us, I think is very similar between both of them.
Yeah, and wouldn't you say that in medieval society, not so much today, but in medieval society, these were two of the groups who had their own distinct religions and cults, and therefore were not going to be incorporated into the Christianity of the times?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's also very true.
What good things does witchcraft, as you see it and practice it, have to offer us in our society and times?
Well, I think the revival of witchcraft and the goddess traditions, like the revival of other indigenous and native traditions, raises this question of the sacred again, and forces us, society, to deal with this question of what is sacred to us and where is it and what are we going to do about it. And I happen to believe that if, given the mess that we're in this world, the environmental mess, the issues that we're dealing with on so many levels around women's rights and around just preserving the earth, that this is a very vital insight. It doesn't mean that everyone should become a witch or everyone should necessarily embrace it, but I think if we as a society could say, all right, there are these two views of the sacred. There's the transcendent and the immanent. And we've gone way to the transcendent side for the last 500 years, but we need to at least give the immanent side the respect it deserves. Then we would have a dialogue that would be framed very deep. Our dialogue around things, for example, like should we cut down the old growth forests, would be a very different dialogue if we could rise up and say, wait a minute, for a large body of people, we say these things have a sacred value in and of themselves that cannot be measured or compromised. And for you to cut them down would be for you to, raise the temple in Jerusalem or bomb the Vatican. It's on that level of horror. And so we need to look at some other ways to find jobs for people and work for people rather than sacrificing this, because what is sacred cannot be compromised. We would look at the question of Native people's claims to their sacred lands very differently. The Native Hawaiian people went to the Supreme Court with a lawsuit about a geothermal installation that they're trying to put into their sacred rainforest on the Big Island that's sacred to their goddess Pele. And to the Hawaiians, even to Howleys who go live there in the island for very long, Pele is a very real force. You don't mess with her because she's the volcano and she arises. And the first geothermal installation they put in actually on the volcano rapidly became a lava lake. But they took this to the Supreme Court as an issue of religious freedom, saying you can't put this in our rainforest because this is sacred to us. We need it to practice our religion. We need it alive and thriving. Otherwise, we don't have the things we need for our religion. And the Supreme Court ruled that land-based traditions don't have to be considered under religious freedom things in the same way that other religions do. To me, that's a very blatant violation of what we're supposed to have in our Constitution that protects differences of religion. And also, our whole dialogue about, right now we seem embroiled in these two things, like should lesbians and gays be in the military? And, you know, should people be allowed to murder doctors because they perform abortions? You know, we would be having a very different dialogue about these things if for the last 500 years simply had, you know, as a respected and acknowledged spiritual tradition, the idea that for many, many people, pleasure is sacred. That a woman's right to her body, that her authority over comes from her body, is hers, and that this is, again, a religious value, that should be hers. Right now we have a debate that seems to go between the anti-abortion claim religion and everyone else who sort of gets left out in the cold. But we would be able to say, no, you know, there's another way to look at religion, and, you know, our will, our choice, our ability to choose, that also has a sacred value.
I think we should take some questions from the audience, and since we're not using the side mics, either Starhawk or I will repeat the question. Why don't you go ahead and repeat the question when it...
Okay.
Okay.
I'm curious as to how you define cult and the distinct parallels between occultism or cults. And like I've heard it related to Christianity later, it's kind of a sort of abortion issue. And you know, if you can understand that cult and
Uh-huh.
relation to that.
The question is, how do I define cult, and do I see any parallels with Christianity or the fundamentalist traditions? Or is that right? Yeah, briefly. I guess a cult is someone else's religion. I think, you know, if you define a cult as a religion with a very strict top-down hierarchy where people don't have the right of dissent, you're going to be in very big trouble when you look at some of the, and that you might seem very nice, but maybe you really weren't. And I said, well, I don't think that is true. I think if you're in touch with your intuition will tell you if you are dealing with someone who's evil. And anyway, you know, you can look at the group and look at the structure. If the group is open, if the leader is open to questions, if there's a sense that individuals make their own decisions, that their own qualms or questions are respected, that their own moral decisions are respected, that they're free to leave the group if they disagree. You know, that's one thing. And if you have another group where all the decisions come from the top, where you're not allowed to question, where dissent is punished, where you're not allowed to leave the group unless you disagree so much you're kicked out of the group, then you start to get into something very dangerous. And at that point, the priest who was taking the class sort of turned very pale. And suddenly everybody started to like blush and laugh. And I actually honestly hadn't been thinking about the Vatican at all when I was saying that. So I hope that answers your question.
Why don't you, since you're answering?
Okay, in the back. Mm-hmm. She was talking about the definition of the word witch and hag and why that still gives the definition as evil woman. And it's because the dictionaries haven't caught up with the times yet or haven't gone back to the roots clearly enough. There are some pagan groups who have taken on as a project attempting to lobby the compilers of dictionaries, but that's one of the little bastions of slow change in the hedge. And it referred again to the person who sits on the hedge, which was the boundary between the village and the wild, the one who has a foot in both worlds, who integrates the wild and ordinary daily domestic life. Yes?
I was wondering, there's a current debate in modern feminism on whether there's one general spirituality that fits all women,
Do I see witchcraft as a spirituality for women or for men and women to share, and is there a common women's spirituality? Witchcraft is very much a spirituality for women and men both. It always has been, even though the witch persecutions were primarily directed against women for reasons we've outlined, which has left us with the idea that all the witches were women. There always were men who were witches, and today there are men who are witches. There tend to be more women than men, partly because I think women get more disenchanted with patriarchal religions faster and more intrigued by the idea of a religion that offers a goddess figure. But there also are a lot of men, and more men all the time. Also, actually, it's true that in any religion there are more women than men. Even if you go to church, you know, in the Catholic Church, and you see who's actually there praying, there's a lot more women than men. So I don't know why that is or what that means. I don't think it's that women are innately more spiritual. I think it has something to do with the way we're socialized. I think it's to assume there's a common spirituality or a common anything for all women and gloss over our differences. And witchcraft has never been a religion that claims to be universal or wants to proselytize. We've always believed that all spiritual paths have their own kind of validity, and that different ones are necessary for different people, because you, at your given moment of development for what you need to learn or what challenges you need, might need something very different from what I need. And that, you know, the reality that spirituality talks about, that ultimate reality, is a mystery. It's something we can't really name and define. And so all the images we use, all the rituals we do, in a way, are poetry. They're metaphors, they're approximations. They're not absolute definitions. And so I would, again, for me, I think it's important that witchcraft and that paganism, which is a kind of broader, more general term, be able to be accorded the same kind of respect and seriousness as any other religious tradition. But I wouldn't want everyone in the world to be a witch, or even every woman in the world to be a witch. I think that would make the world much more boring than it potentially could be. Once it did, it had a life of its own. I mean, doctors often were involved in diagnosing a case of witchcraft, and they got paid. The jailers got paid. The witch had to pay, you know, for her own incarceration and pay for her own torture. And so it's kind of like trying to close the military bases today, you know. So once it's there, everyone's making a living off it. Nobody wants to end it.
No, she's
Oh, the
Satan
satanic
cults.
cults.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are satanic groups. What connection does witchcraft have with satanic cults, and do they really take children and kill them, and why, you know? There are satanic groups that are known and organized, and who actually witches consider to be sort of a Christian heresy that has nothing to do with us, because their entire framework is in Christian terms. It's just turned around. The satanic groups, you know, that are, for example, there are groups in, like the Temple of Set and what's his name? I can't think of his name now. Have so used that issue for their propaganda that they've completely muddied the waters, as far as I can tell. I have met some people who have told me they are survivors of some sort of ritual abuse who I believed. I have met other people who told me they were survivors of ritual abuse who I felt were what, when I was trained as a psychologist, we were taught to call, had a less than structured personality. And I have also know a lot of documented cases of essentially overt lies, or people that are put forward by fundamentalist groups to make all these kinds of claims, especially the very, very extreme claims that were later disproved. I do know that the FBI and the police force in general has become very reluctant to investigate most of these cases because they could never find any physical evidence. And there are people who will say, you know, that there are reasons for that, and that isn't proof that they don't exist, and I think that's probably true, but I think it is proof that it doesn't go on the kind of massive scale that the fundamentalists would have us believe. I also think that there's a real strong agenda in making people believe that sexual abuse of children is this weird, exotic thing that takes place in satanic cults, and ignore the fact that most sexual abuse of children goes on in the family or among people that are friends or relatives or close to the family. Wicca, with witchcraft as we practice it, with feminist spirituality, that this is exactly what our religion would be most horrified, and it would, you know, for us this is like the worst kind of crime that you could commit. The worst kind of blasphemy would be to harm a child or to harm someone sexually, because sex is sacred. And that if something is done like that, it needs to be prosecuted, it needs to be dealt with all the systems that we have in place for dealing with crime and for healing the people who are victims and survivors of those kinds of crimes.
Maybe let's take one more
Yes.
question.
Before closing, this is the subject of the Holocaust. I have a statement, not really a question. I'd like to just tie this all up to date very rapidly. In the medieval times, the folklore supported by the church, as you heard, witches were in consort with the devil. The other side of this was the Jews were the servants of the devil. The net result was that the devil was doing his work through infanticide. The last major case of infanticide in the Western world was in 1922, where a Jewish man in Russia, Mendel Bialis, was arrested, tortured, and accused by the Russians of this fabrication of killing a Christian child with blood. It was dramatized in a book and a movie by that name. And less than a couple of weeks ago, a metropolitan of the Orthodox Church in Russia started bringing out some of these old canards in public. And he was roundly condemned by the rest of the church. So this folklore stuff lies very, very hard, still around.
I will say also there was an oral tradition among witches that the witches often harbored Jews during the times of persecution and saved them from the Inquisition. But I do have to admit that I have never heard this oral tradition among Jews.
Of harboring witches.
No, that they were ever harbored by witches or harbored witches. Reaction to my mother telling her that I was a witch was, a witch? Who ever heard of a nice Jewish girl doing such a thing?
Thank you for coming, Starhawk. There's always more questions that we can entertain, but if you don't break at a certain point,
Right.
everybody starts going out the doors and slamming them anyway, so. Yeah, so, yes.
So strict in the person. I saw the movie 2 weeks ago on women's history, and I was wondering if
Thank
that where
you.
you
Yes, I'm making a collection.
About what?
Speak